Hello! Welcome to day 2 of the free Yoga Basics training. Today we are going to be covering yoga equipment, yoga accessories, everything you need from a material perspective to start your practice. I'm really excited to dive in because I get a lot of questions about yoga props. So let's go. You might be thinking, which yoga props do I really need in order to start my practice? Well, when I started doing yoga, I knew I needed a mat. That one seemed obvious to me. But when it came to blocks and straps, I wasn't quite sure, and I thought they'd make me feel like an amateur. Which, surprise, I was an amateur. I resisted props for a long time because I didn't think I needed them. Turns out I did. And I still do. So I want to cover the recommended props that I have for beginners, the types, the price points, and what makes the most sense for getting started, and the things I wish I knew about yoga props when I started. I'll even get real about expensive yoga mats and clothes and the excessive items that you don't need when you're starting out, at least not yet. So, yoga mats. Probably the most important item that you need to start your yoga practice. It's one of those things where people don't know what kind to buy, and the price points are so huge, it's really hard to understand what type of mat you need and how much money you should spend. So I've broken them down into 3 different categories, and we'll cover each of them, and I'll kind of talk to you about what they mean and how you might be able to pick your mat. So the first category is the basic store-bought beginner's mat. So, great mat, this is how I started my practice. I actually got my mat, which I've said this probably a million times on the internet now, but I got my first mat at TJ Maxx for $7. It was a thin, kind of foamy pink mat. It had an inspirational quote on it, and I loved it. It was like my companion in the beginning of my practice. These are great mats if you're just trying to test the waters and see if you even want to continue forward with your practice, if you're not quite sure if this is for you and you want to start kind of slow. So a beginner's mat, you're not going to see them in the store titled beginner's mat, but typically a mat between $15 and $30 is the least expensive you're going to get and a good place to start. Now I will say that this type of mat is challenging to use in, say, a hot yoga class or a class where you're moving a lot, because if you sweat a lot, you'll start slipping around and they don't have as much support. So know that if you go for like a basic beginner's mat, it's not going to be the same quality or offer the same type of support that a more expensive mat will. So that leads me into the second category, which is the kind of expensive but worth it mat. So this is kind of the sweet spot for a good mat, I think. They range from like $40 to $80, $88. There are different brands like Manduka and Jade, B-Mat, Lululemon, Hugger Mugger, Prana. There's a huge list of all of the various yoga mats. But this type of mat, so like this price range, I believe, is where you're going to get like a good long-term mat that's going to hold up and not fall apart or cause you a lot of problems during a class. These types of mats come in different textures and sizes and lengths, whereas the least expensive mat is just like a soft, foamy, kind of bumpy type of, and that's not all of them, but that's typically what you see. So these mats might be a little smoother, a little bit more grippiness, but you might also still run into the issues of slipping around and not being able to support yourself on your mat or like get grippiness on your mat, depending on which one you buy. And that all just depends on the brand and the style. The third category then is the gift yoga mat, I would say. So this is like the yoga mat that you like pray someone buys you for your birthday or for like holidays. I had a really hard time in the beginning with buying an expensive mat because I had my $7 mat. It was my little companion. I didn't need anything else until I started going to different types of classes, and it was too thin. I was slipping around. It started to fall apart, honestly, because I was using it so much. and I knew I needed to buy a better mat. And I Googled and I Googled and I tried to search everywhere, and I was dead set on like finding a deal on a good mat because I like discounts and bargains. I mean, couldn't help it. So I found kind of in the other category, so the second category, I found like this really nice Manduka mat that was priced at like $80, and I got it on sale for like $60 at a sporting goods store. So I was super pumped. So it kind of fell in between the second and third categories, I'd say. It was a little closer to $90 originally, but I got it for like, maybe it was $65. I don't know. But I had that mat for a while. I took it into a yoga class and I still slid around. And I just couldn't find my like grounding. I was sweating so much. So I could have used a yoga mat towel, which I'll get to in a second. But in this third category, your more expensive mats that range from like $90 to $150 they're typically like natural rubber and made with like some eco-friendly type materials that are more sweat absorbent. They're higher quality. They're better for the earth. They're just like a really high quality natural. Not you can't say natural necessarily, but the higher you get, typically the better the mat. And that's kind of a hard decision to weigh because it's quite expensive when you're starting a practice and you're not really sure if you're going to stick with it. But the mat that I have now is comparable to this mat pictured here, which is the Lie For Me mat, Liforme. I think they might be the most expensive mat, but it's that natural rubber with the eco polyurethane coating on it. They have like alignment cues. It's an awesome mat. And the mat that I have is that exact mat, only not that brand. So maybe I'll share some of that later, but I'm working on a yoga mat offering that is not as expensive and really great quality to release later on in the future. So eventually, like, I think that's the best mat to have, but it's expensive and, it's an investment. So something to consider. A few other questions about mats is like, what's up with the smell? Most mats come with like this rubbery, stinky smell. And over time, like of wiping them down with like a mat cleaner, the smell will go away. But like most mats have a funky smell and it's weird, but they're rubber. So I think that's just how it goes. It's kind of hard to find a like lovely smelling mat as soon as you buy it. So use your mat and like that top coat will wear down and it won't smell as bad, but also take care of your mat. So always clean your mat with a natural cleaner and like a rag. In regard to like materials and types of mats, there are like rubber mats like that we talked about. There are cork mats. There are like cloth and cotton mats. So there are a bunch of different options. I prefer a rubber mat. I've seen cork mats over time start to break and fall apart like cork would. And I think they kind of smell over time if you sweat too much into them. But they're cool products. There's standard length mats, and then there's longer length mats if you're taller or prefer more room to move around on. Just note that if you have a long mat and you go into a studio, your mat might unfold onto someone else's if it's a really packed class. So something to be mindful of if you get like an extra long mat. There are also standard mats, and then there are travel mats. So if you want to have a mat that you like take on vacations and trips with you, there are like skinnier foldable mats that you can stick in your suitcase, and I hear people like them. I don't have one. I used to travel with my mat everywhere, and then I realized I didn't need a yoga mat to do yoga, so I stopped. But I know a lot of people like traveling with their mat, so there are some options there too. And then of course, if you opt for a less expensive mat or a mat that doesn't have a lot of grippiness, you can always get a yoga mat towel that you can put over your towel. So if you're in a super sweaty class, you can continue on and not be slipping around and hurt yourself. So once we have our yoga mat, there are definitely some props that I think are necessary. Props that I've talked about that like I wasn't quite sure of in the beginning, I was resistant to, and now like they're my saving grace. So the first and most important prop that I think there is the yoga block. and actually yoga blocks. So I think you need two. I was pretty resistant to them in the beginning until I learned how to use them. So since then, I'm constantly reaching for mine. I have foam blocks, cork blocks, plastic blocks. I have skinny blocks, wider blocks. Like there are so many different options, but there's like a standard. This blue one right here in this image is like the standard size yoga block that you'll probably want to look for. And they range from like $10 to $30. Like you can get them pretty cheap on Amazon. So I would definitely get 2 yoga blocks and a yoga mat to like start your practice, and you'll be set. The cork blocks are a little bit heavier and they're kind of harder to use. They're not as comfortable to like sit in meditation on or pick up and move around. So the foam blocks are easier to like move and pick up and use during your practice. The other item, so yoga straps. Yoga straps are fantastic. Again, they help you get into poses that you can't quite reach for yet. So if you're trying to reach for your toes and you're standing and you can't quite reach for them, you could always loop your strap around your foot and quote unquote like extend your arm. So it's like extra length on your arms or legs or wherever you are trying to reach for without hurting yourself or, going into an unsafe position. And my favorite way to use my strap when I'm not using my strap is to use it as a mat sling. So I kind of knot up each end and I tie it around my mat and then I throw it over my shoulder and I go. So I don't have to buy an expensive mat bag, or they have mat slings available that are just slings for your mat, which just use your yoga strap. It seems like there's just too many strappy things going on. But yeah, it's multi-purpose. So I love yoga straps. There are also bolsters. So definitely not something you need to look into if you're like going to studios and they have bolsters and all the equipment you need. But if you're starting a home practice and you're really interested in like restorative and slow yin yoga, a bolster is great to have. I sit on mine, I lay on mine, I like melt into it. There's a bunch of different ways you can use them, but they do vary in price range too. So I would look on Amazon and see which one works for you best if you want one. And then of course, the yoga wheel, the beautiful, like majestic yoga equipment that you see on Instagram and all over the internet. And you're like, I need one of those, right? Not necessarily. I would say when you're starting, probably not. You can use your block to do the same types of things that you could with a yoga wheel. And you probably won't need this until a little bit later in your practice when you're wanting to practice inversions and deeper back bends and stuff like that. But they do have a lot of different options from plastic and cork, wood. I think the wood ones are the most expensive and your plastic ones are like your least expensive. And then of course there are different sizes, different textures. Some of them have rubbery textures on them. Some of them have corky textures. It just depends. I have 2 of them, but they were both gifts. So I've not bought myself a yoga wheel yet. So it's one of those things where it's nice to have, but you don't need it necessarily. So what about other accessories and clothing? Like you'll see yoga wedges and grippy toe socks and grippy hand gloves, and there's a lot of different additional items you might want, maybe. I don't think they're necessary, but you could search stores on the internet forever with all the different options of things you could buy, and it's not really going to matter unless you like start your practice. Yoga clothes are tricky, in my opinion. I know a lot of people care very much about what they're wearing, and there's a lot of fashion-forward people. So I think this is a very subjective matter, and I don't think that yoga clothing should like stop you from doing yoga, or your body size should stop you from doing yoga, or anything like that. So if you want expensive yoga clothes, go for it, but I wouldn't make that be the thing that stops you from practicing or starting practicing. It's really where you're comfortable and what fits, and then you can determine how much you're willing to spend on that stuff. I would also do research on clothing companies because I think that's really important. There are some great companies out there and then some not so great companies. And I think the most important thing to stress here is you don't technically need any of the above stuff to do yoga. Like you can do yoga right here, right now, wherever you are. You don't need a mat even. it's nice to have a mat, but like you could just start doing yoga right now. And you have to modify and adjust to whatever environment you're in, but you don't need this stuff to do yoga. They're just accessories and equipment and items that can help you. So don't let the thought of buying a bunch of stuff stop you from starting. Just remember, I started on my $7 mat, and that's all. Do your research, make sure you're understanding all of the different options before you start buying stuff, because it can be a little overwhelming if you start buying a lot of items and then you feel like you don't know where to start with all of them. So speaking of how to use yoga props and equipment, I'm going to go into this a lot more in tomorrow's video when I show you poses. I'll actually be able to like show you in a video how to implement a prop or adjust to add a prop while you're in a flow or whatever's happening. But here are some different ways you can use these props and equipment. In the picture on the left, I'm using a strap to get into king pigeon. So I couldn't quite reach my foot, but I was really interested in working toward that pose and reaching all the way toward my foot. So I simply put my strap around my foot and held it and started working toward it. The middle picture is a yoga wheel. So this is me playing with some arm balances and some progress over time with my yoga wheel. Again, you don't really need that yoga wheel to be practicing arm balances and inversions, but it was helpful for me because I was kind of scared to go upside down. And then the last picture is me doing fish pose while laying on a block. So this pose can be done with or without a block, but it's super great to like lay on the block and let your body melt around it. And that's just one of the thousands of ways you can use your yoga block. But basically you can use any of your props, sitting, standing, laying. I remember in my yoga teacher training, we did an entire flow with like yoga blocks between our thighs. So we had to like keep the yoga blocks and we couldn't drop them. It was pretty intense. So it was just kind of a general practice, like kind of basic, not too hard, but adding that block in there like took it up 10 notches and it was pretty intense. So over the next 3 days, we're going to discuss some basic poses and how to modify them, especially to avoid injuries and know where your body's limits are. And that will be like a video of me doing poses tomorrow. So you'll see that. We've covered types of yoga and yoga that best suits you, understanding props and equipment today. Tomorrow will be the poses and modifications. And then we'll go into self-doubt and comparison and then an actual step-by-step system for starting. So that's what's coming next. Let me know what you think about yoga props in the chat box below. If you have any questions about the past 2 days, whether it's about yoga practices and styles, approaches, modalities, any of the other stuff, how to use a prop. If I didn't mention a prop that you're curious about, drop it in the chat box and we'll discuss it. Yeah, stay tuned for video 3 coming to your inbox tomorrow about some poses and how to modify them, all of the different ways they can look, and we'll keep going from here.